Crispin Glover, it's a great honour to have you on the show. Thanks so much for giving us some of your time.
Yes, glad to be here.
As is custom on our show, I was wondering if you could give us a brief biography of yourself.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. I'm not normally asked to do it, so I don't know. I am not as prepared as perhaps I should be. I don't know what's a good place to start or stop, or how brief I would be. I was born 1964, New York City in New York, and moved to Los Angeles when I was relatively young with my mother and father. My mother retired as a dancer and actress when I was born, and my father still continues to act. And my parents are still married. I went to a small private school from from first to ninth grade. I began acting professionally at age 13 under my own interest in doing so. My father's, as I said, an actor, and mother retired as a dancer and actress, so I'd grown up around the business. I didn't work too much as under the age of 18, but started working a lot more in film in particular at age 18, and started making my own feature films. I started shooting What Is It in 1996, and premiered it in Sundance 2005. And its sequel, It Is Fine, Everything Is Fine, in 2007. I've been touring with those films ever since, which has changed my life quite a bit in these last 9 years. And I'm shooting the third feature film, which is not part 3 of what will be the trilogy currently, which is a film that I've been developing for many years for myself and my father to act in. It's the first time he and I have ever acted together. And I still touring with the films and acting in other people's movies, and continuing to make my own films. So that's my biography.
Excellent. Right, I really want to talk in this interview mainly about your own films, and also I'd like to talk with you about the Czech Republic, if possible.
Yeah.
Because I think all of these things are really interesting, and will be interesting to our listeners as well.
Good.
So let's start off with What Is It? There's a kind of a long history involved in it. I'd quite like to maybe go through that with you. Could you give us kind of like the background into the making of the film? You know, how it came about, and maybe we could talk about some of the underlying themes within it.
It's kind of a long and slightly confusing history, because before I made What Is It, there was a screenplay for a different feature that I was looking to get corporate backing for, that initially started out where 2 young writers had approached me in 1996 with the screenplay that they wanted me to act in. And it was around that time I understood at the time that they had financial backing because they had made a monetary offer to me through my agents. And I read the script with that idea, but it was around that time that I had kind of felt like the next first time corporately funded film director that I worked with, it should be myself. I read the screenplay, and there were things about it that I thought were interesting, but there were things about it that didn't quite work entirely. And for me, structurally or story-wise, but I saw that there was a problem that could be solved by something within it, and I said to them I'd be interested in acting in the film if I could rework some of the concepts and direct it. They came and met with me to hear what my thoughts were, and I let them know that there were a lot of different things, but the main thing I wanted to do is have a majority of the characters in the film to be played by actors with Down syndrome. They were okay with the concept, and I set about to rewriting the screenplay, and then David Lynch agreed to executive produce that for me to direct, which is a very nice thing for him to do. Executive production can mean somebody puts money in, or they can be somebody that would lead to money coming in, which was what David Lynch was doing, which again was very nice. I went to one of the larger corporate entities in Los Angeles at the time that would fund so-called independent films, and they were interested. I had a number of name actors that were interested in being it as well. And after a number of meetings and conversations, they let me know that they were concerned about funding a film wherein a majority of the characters were played by actors with Down syndrome. So it was decided I should write a short screenplay to promote this as a viable idea that we would shoot as a, like I say, a promotion for corporate interest to prove that it was, viable to have a majority of the characters played by actors with Down syndrome. So I wrote a short 20-something page screenplay wherein all of the characters were to be played by actors with Down syndrome. And that screenplay, the short screenplay, was called What Is It? And when I edited, we shot that in 4 days. When I edited it together, it became, it took me about 6 months. I taught myself how to use Adobe Premiere. Again, this was 96, which is early adoption of that for a long-form video. I remember calling on the tech support, letting them know that I was making a long-form movie with their application with Adobe Premiere, and they said, "Oh yeah, there's somebody out in Idaho who's doing that as well." It was like that wasn't what people were doing at the time. Of course, it took so long. I had a very bad technical problem, and on top of I did more shooting when I started turning it into a feature. But by the time I finally premiered it in Sundance, digital editing was no longer new. Yeah. But when I adopted it, it really was. Yeah. In any case, so I edited that together in a 6-month time period, and that short came in at 84 minutes. It was which is longer even than the feature film is now. And I ended up shooting 8 more days to those initial 4 days to turn it into the feature, so more than double. But I realized it was too long for what I had, but I realized with more work I could turn it into a feature. And over the next 2.5 years, or 2 years, I shot some more footage, like I say, 8 days more, and continued to edit. Then there was a very bad technical problem. Initially, my initial plan was it was shot on standard 16, and now there was a digital intermediate and blown up to a 35 millimeter print. Both of the features are 35 millimeter prints, and but my initial plan was that I was going to shoot on 16 and make a 16 millimeter print, which I would tour around with. In 96, there were still enough art house venues that had 16 millimeter projection that seemed viable. It was good that I didn't do that. It was just a coincidence because there were some technical problems with what would be called opticals, now would be called digital effects, that there was something with the SMPTE time code that had been mislaid by the company that I'd hired to do it, or somebody put me in contact with, and it really caused terrible problems for literally 5 years. And then the digital intermediate ended up coming down in price in that time interim, and I was finally able to do the digital intermediate, which led to the 35 millimeter print, which is still what I'm touring with. And of course now even 35 millimeter projection is starting to be replaced with digital projection, which that's a whole other topic. In any case, what I more importantly realized when I turned the short film into the feature was that it wasn't I realized that what the corporation was questioning was not really the viability of having a majority of the characters played by actors with Down syndrome, but it was the concept itself of having a majority of the characters played by actors with Down syndrome wherein those characters do not necessarily have Down syndrome. And that's a very important distinction, because you'll see corporate movies or television shows where there are actors in it that have Down syndrome, but but inevitably the characters that they're playing will supposed to be characters that do themselves have Down syndrome. And even that might not be very popular, but you will see that in corporately funded and distributed film or television. But what you will not see is you will not see actors with Down syndrome playing characters that do not necessarily have Down syndrome. And the reason that's an important distinction is because what corporations get concerned about, and this I came to the realization of in '96, was that the corporations are concerned that people might ask questions like, why are you doing this? Are you making fun of these people? Are you taking advantage of these people? But, which I had no intention or interest, still I would find that uninteresting personally to do those things. And it wasn't on my mind at all. Like I said, the concept was originally to solve a problem in a different screenplay. But I realized that another word for this is these kind of things, that people can have questions or different feelings about what is right or wrong. That's another word for that is taboo. And so I realized I innately had this taboo subject within the structure of the film, and there were other things that had taboo elements even from when it was a short. And I realized that this was something that corporations were concerned about en masse. And I think it's become increasingly apparent, especially in the last few years, that corporations are essentially propaganda machines. Mm-hmm. They do not want questioning audiences, thoughtful, informed people that could question the corporations essentially out of existence, because corporations only exist legally because they're allowed to. But there's an imbalance that's happening right now with control of corporations that does need to be addressed politically. Luckily, I've seen in the last few years where there are people that are realizing, particularly specifically in the United States, that an amendment needs to be passed, which hasn't happened in quite a long time in the U.S., that will control the monies that are going into politics, because right now there's a legalized bribery in the U.S., and this ultimately leads to corporations being able to control laws, and that controls people's lives. And what I was reacting to way back in '96 is that it was controlling art, which is what I really care about. I kind of hate politics. I don't like that stuff. I like art, but I don't like actors talking about politics. I just find it uninteresting. But when it affects art, it's something that I feel vitally concerned about. And so I know this is a UK, we're in the UK, but I might as well, people listen to these things worldwide, and I do think it's a valid thing to sign up for. There are people that want to pass an amendment in the U.S. about getting legalized bribery out of politics in the U.S. With a new amendment, and people can go to wolf-pac.com and sign up for this. And because if it doesn't happen, the corporate controls that are allowed right now are going to get continually worse to a truly nightmarish proportion. It's already bad and probably worse than people realize. But it's something that needs to be addressed. Anyhow, what is it was something that was reacting to this artfully back in '96, and I'm very glad to see that it's coming forth with political actions, even though it's seemingly unrelated. To me, it's exactly related. Now, it is fine. The second film, I had actually read way back in 1986. It was written by a man who I ended up incorporating into What Is It, even though I initially, in the short film, he was not, I didn't think of him as part of it. But I'd always, as soon as I read his screenplay in 1986, knew that I would be the person that would have to fund it. And when I was expanding What Is It into a feature, I realized there were thematic associations, probably subconsciously or however you want to put it, in my mind that had been implanted by this screenplay I'd read way back in 1986. This is the second film in the trilogy now. It's called It Is Fine, Everything Is Fine. It was written by Stephen C. Stewart, who is a man that was born with a very severe case of cerebral palsy. When Steve's mother died when he was in his early 20s, he was placed into a nursing home where he really did not want to be. And the people that were taking care of him there, he couldn't get out for about 10 years. And the people that were taking care of him there would derisively call him an MR, a mental retard, which is not a nice thing to say to anybody, but Steve was of normal intelligence, and the emotional turmoil he must have gone through for that decade, I can't even begin to imagine.
It must have been terrible.
Of course. Mm. And when he got out of that nursing home, finally, he wrote this screenplay in the style of a 1970s U.S. TV murder mystery movie of the week, wherein he's the bad guy. And this was something that was really important to Steve. That he played a bad guy. If you think about it, and you see a corporately funded and distributed movie, and there's a character with a disability, basically that character is a benefactor to society. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. There are plenty of people with disabilities who are benefactors to society. But what was important to Steve was that he was a person with a disability, emphasis on person, with a disability, who wanted to play a bad guy. People can have dark thoughts, and he was a person with a disability, but a person who wanted to show that dark thoughts exist in that community as well. And he plays a he plays a real bad guy in this movie. And there's something about the fact that he wrote it in this genre style, in this TV murder mystery movie of the week style, as opposed to a standard autobiography, that makes certain truths of his subconscious, I feel like, stand out in a very fascinating way. Yeah. I'm really proud of this movie. When the whole trilogy is done, I feel like this film will be the best film in the trilogy. But not only that, I feel like it'll be the best film I'll have anything to do with in my whole career. I'm very, very passionate about the film. Yeah. And it has to do with an emotional catharsis that happens with Steve's character. Mm-hmm. I hold that on a very high level. And I do not mean to dismiss What Is It, because I'm very proud of that film as well. It's just that the emotional catharsis is a rare thing. And when that happens, it's something that is quite important.
Yeah, I mean, let's go back to What Is It a little bit. When I've seen the film myself, I saw it when you were in England last time at ATP, and I thought it was fantastic. There was definitely within the film, it did seem to be a kind of reaction to what you call propaganda, and what I would say is, I think when a lot of people hear the word propaganda, they think that people are talking about political propaganda, as in communist propaganda, right, for example. Whereas when you talk about it, I feel it's more about a kind of negative interaction between the media and the observer, as it were.
Specifically, when I'm using the word, I mean, propaganda is a fascinating subject. You can call correctly what you and I are talking about right now propaganda as well. But what I'm anybody that's essentially propagating an idea, trying to get an idea across, is using propaganda, which isn't necessarily negative. There's a fascinating book written in 1928 by Edward Bernays of the title Propaganda. And this is more of the propaganda that I'm talking about. Edward Bernays is the literal father of the public relations industry. He was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. The reason Sigmund Freud was brought over to the U.S. in the 1920s was because his nephew, Edward Bernays, understood that his uncle's understanding of the human subconscious would be able to be utilized for U.S. media, government, and academia to make the underclasses feel as though they were doing things that were good for themselves, where in fact they're serving the purposes of corporate industry. And this is essentially how the U.S. works. When I'm using the word propaganda, that's the kind of propaganda I'm talking about. It's the propaganda that is made for essentially the working or underclasses feel as though they're doing something good for themselves, but in fact they're serving corporate interests. And this is very carefully calculated, and much more carefully calculated than people realize. And it goes all the way through all media that's corporately funded and distributed, and academia, which is corporately sponsored. And of course, the U.S. government is, and this is why that amendment I was talking about earlier is so important, the U.S. government is sponsored legally now by corporations, which put the politicians into the power positions to make the laws which favor corporations and not people at large. So all of these things need to be fully discussed and put out in the open, and I see the discussion happening about politics, it's true, which is good. What I don't see the discussion of is about film and television, and that what people are watching, 99.999% of what people watch on a daily basis as entertainment is specific propaganda that was funded and distributed. I mean, if you're watching it, basically it was probably distributed by corporations. Those corporations have to have an approval of what the content is. And again, those corporations do not want intelligent, thoughtful, questioning populists that will realize that the reason the corporations enjoy their existence is because people are allowing it. As soon as people realize that corporations need to serve people's interests, those corporations will be strongly controlled in a good way. Corporations don't have to be a bad thing. Just what it means is a group of people coming together to do something, which of course can be, humans are social animals, and they do great things in order to serve themselves often. But unfortunately, the way corporations are currently existing, they can control human existence in a way that is not necessarily good for the human beings. And that's what needs to be changed. When corporations in the U.S. initially were allowed, I believe it was called something like a lock-stock company, and the corporations had to get permission, and then they had a limited time that they were allowed to be in existence, and then they were disbanded, or they had to get permission to make sure that they were continuing to do beneficial things to the culture. This is what needs to happen, because it's I mean, at this point it seems like minor little things, like you get passed around on the telephone, or put on hold, or press button number 2 and then button number 3, and then you're connected to the wrong person for AT&T or whatever it is. But it's an abuse of time, and there's this huge amount of money that's made by those corporations, which of course people are putting into. But then your time is wasted. Instead of the more people being hired, which would be good for the economy in general, it's less people hired and more people put on hold on the telephone. I mean, that sounds like a minor nuisance, but it is a nuisance. And it's like, what I'm talking about, of course, seems trivial, but it doesn't. It gets much worse than that. It gets to the point where people are put in lines for whatever nefarious means in reality, as opposed to on a telephone, and it will get worse unless it's truly confronted. So these kinds of discussions about understanding what propaganda is within actual movie making. Movies use metaphors to make people feel comfortable with things. And I would say it's not the only thing that's happening in U.S. Films and media, but one of the main purposes, I would say, that's clear as to what the U.S. media is doing is to make the U.S. population feel comfortable with the idea, the propagandistic idea, that the U.S. is a policeman of the world that is right to essentially kill other people in other countries. And, of course, that's horrible. It's a very, very bad thing. And most people out of the United States are quite aware of it, but many people in the United States are not aware of it. And the amount of things that are going on, in news, those things are more evident, but it happens in the storytelling. And the storytelling of films and television, the storytelling uses metaphors like aliens, evil aliens, so-called evil aliens coming in, invading, and then good American families coming together and fighting off aliens and killing aliens. I mean,
it's kind of metaphorical in itself.
Yeah,
isn't it?
What's the metaphor? It's obvious what the metaphor is. It's very scary. It's very creepy, and a lot of other countries don't make movies like that, but the United States does often. And who are funding those big movies like that? They're corporations. Corporations know that this is good for that concept of continuing to have people that will be sent off and killing, supposedly defending whatever, but no, they're killing people, and that's not good.
Yeah, I mean, I know what you mean. If you go to the cinema these days, it's almost a surprise when you see a film that makes you question anything, and it's like
right.
It happens.
That's the other thing. That's the other thing that happens. You either have absolute online propaganda. I just gave an example of one thing, but there are multiple things. Or you have distraction, which is just basically stupidity. Something that will just make people not think about anything, which makes people that they don't want people to be thinking, going, well, why is this happening? Why is my kid or my friend or these people going off to do this stuff in this place I don't know about? Instead of thinking about that, it's like there's just stuff that distracts. That's like, oh, well, I'm not thinking about this. I've just got this, whatever thing to occupy my mind. And I would say there's probably even more of that than there is of the actual online propaganda, the pointed propaganda.
Yeah.
But they serve essentially the same function. One says, do feel comfortable with this, and the other just says, don't think about anything at all, just be dumb and enjoy it.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I was thinking about last night when you were talking at the Q&A was, do you think that there's a possibility that the reason we don't see people with, say, disabilities or with Down syndrome in films, portraying people?
We will see people with Down syndrome. Oh, but you're finishing. You're continuing. Yeah.
Do you think that the reason is that the media, the corporations have kind of created this kind of stereotype and are kind of perpetuating a kind of almost like a mutually reinforcing loop of prejudice and propaganda? It's kind of very strange. Of what though? To what point? Of kind of alienating people with disabilities.
Well, I think I wouldn't say. The weird thing about propaganda also is that it's. I think what. Someone like, what we standardly think of propaganda is, like you were saying earlier, communism or Nazi Germany or something, which definitely did use very strong and pointed propaganda. But the thing that isn't as talked about is every single political entity always uses propaganda, including, the U.S., the UK, what have you. But the interesting thing about it, I think I don't know, somebody said somewhere, and I think it's just well known, that if the best propagandists are people that do not think of what they're doing as that word, as propaganda, which is also why Edward Bernays is the father of the public relations industry. He realized that the word propaganda, and why he was writing that book in 1928, was to rehabilitate the word, because previous to World War I, propaganda did not have a negative connotation, but it did after World War I, because Americans were saying that Germans were using propaganda against their citizens in order to have bad things happen. That was way back in World War I. And so it had a negative connotation from that. Edward Bernays realized he couldn't rehabilitate the word, so he came up with the word combination public relations to replace propaganda. So anytime you hear public relations, just know it's the synonym. It means exactly the same thing. It is propaganda. But again, propaganda is complicated. The best propagandists are people that do not have a negative association with what they're saying. They think what they're doing is good because they've been raised with the propaganda. This is why academia has to be employed in a propagandistic system. People have to be taught, inculcated into this idea at a very young age, and that is how academia works. So, I mean, sure, you're taught interesting things in school as well, but you're taught to think very specific things about what is considered good, what is considered bad, what you should question, what you shouldn't question. And people believe that. If you question certain things that might be genuinely questionable, you can get in a lot of trouble for it.
Yeah.
So sometimes, you know, it's not as though there are committees. That's the part that people get really, I think, confused about when they think about propaganda in a so-called democratic society, which the United States is not a functioning democracy, and getting money out of politics is something that could help to actually make it a functioning democracy. But it was never actually even designed as a functioning democracy. It was designed as something to make people feel as though it was a functioning democracy, and that's what's propagated. But it isn't. It would be better if it was, I would assume. I mean, I'm not a political expert by any means, but I tend toward feeling like that would be helpful, especially when that's what people are taught in the U.S. as to what is happening, but it isn't. Anyhow, committees, people often think of propaganda as like what happened in Nazi Germany, where there were committees that did dictate specifically what people were and were not supposed to do, and it was, you know, met with essentially being killed if you didn't do those things, which of course is a very frightening kind of use of propaganda, but maybe even more insidious is a kind of, people could get mad about that. I don't want to dismiss the terror of something like Nazi Germany, but there is something very terrifying about the kind of propaganda that happens in the United States, where you don't necessarily get killed with a machine gun, or whatever means, but you can be dismissed, you can be isolated, you can be thought of as a bad person for thinking or certain ways and questioning certain things, and that's pretty bad. That's quite bad as well, and very controlling, and so people get concerned they're going to get fired or they're not going to be liked or whatever if they start questioning or propagating ideas that are not of the accepted value. So the reason I started to say this stuff was you started to talk about how people with disabilities may or may not be represented in film. I would say there's not a committee of anybody saying these people should or shouldn't be put into film. In fact, I've become over the years, when we first shot Steve's film, there were no festivals or any kind of movements, certainly that I was aware of. I really don't think there were any that had any kind of funding going towards working with, particularly in film, towards the arts in film of people with disabilities. There are certain festivals now that have to do with that, advocate it. Mm-hmm. But it would be hard for me to say that there has been a conscious decision to exclude people with disabilities in film. I think, though, the norm, a lot of the norm of filmmaking, which it's a slightly different subject matter, but people are often cast in films to be kind of romantic fantasy figures. It's common to have a pretty girl and a handsome guy in some kind of romance love story that men can fantasize about the girl, and women can fantasize about the guy, or whoever's fantasizing about whoever, whatever. But what I'm saying is that there's a tradition of that, even going back to verbalized storytelling. So what I'm trying to say is that it can take a certain kind of thought process that's going into a questioning or a different realm of for lack of a better word, art or thought that is questioning those norms in general. But I don't know that it's a conscious propagandistic element that's coming from kind of corporate interests. It's a complicated subject matter. I'm sure it could be talked about for hours, but that's my initial feeling about it. I'm sure I could get into a discussion with people that would be more informed about it than I am, that might have very different opinions, but that's kind of my initial thought about it.
Yeah. I mean, one thing you were talking about there was questioning things, and before we get on to It Is Fine, Everything Is Fine, I think it's kind of prudent. You've been talking about this a bit recently, about your involvement in Back to the Future, or more importantly, I suppose, your non-involvement in the sequel.
Yeah.
I heard an interview recently with someone called Bob Gale, and he seemed to be at odds with, could you basically tell us about,
tell me what you heard. It was a recent interview with him?
Yeah, it was a radio interview where he was saying about, it was to do with money rather than, integrity and all this kind of thing. And, whereas I've always thought it was due to the fact that you were asking questions to Zemeckis at the time.
Well, Bob Gale is a propagandist. Mm-hmm. And he's very, I mean that in that he's a, again, it's complicated, but he's written little pieces here and there about what some of his political interests are. Mm-hmm. And it's very evident that he's an advocate of things like the wars going on in the Middle East, and now, you could say that that's just his upbringing. He may genuinely think that what's happening in those wars is great, or maybe not. I mean, that's the sense I get from reading some of his slightly political pieces he's written. I do study him because he's made lies about me, mm-hmm. And he doesn't. I mean, the main lie were the prosthetics that were applied to another actor's face based on my face.
They took a cast, didn't they, of your face?
They took the cast that was used from the original film to do the old age makeup, and then they essentially applied my features to another actor's face and interspliced a very small amount of footage from the original film in order to make fool people into believing I was in the film. So there was a lawsuit about this. Because of my lawsuit, there are rules in the Screen Actors Guild that make it so this kind of thing can never happen again. Producers, and so I'm proud of that. Bob Gale, he won't talk about that. He's attempted to obfuscate that he specifically and the other producers did something illegal by definition, and now he's trying to stand up as this, like, I don't know what, a moral, I don't know what you want to call it, but he's coming from a place of being a criminal, essentially. So I mean, I guess because he wrote Back to the Future, people think, oh, well, he's upstanding, but he did something on record. It's easily researchable. He did something illegal, and now he's making up these stories about me, about money, and asking for the same fee as Michael J. Fox. It's as false as the prosthetics that were placed onto the face of this other actor. The guy is a liar who is trying to unbury himself from having done something illegal, and I won't stand for that. This is particularly why I'm being outspoken because I only heard about that now in these Blu-ray releases. He keeps kind of building his story up. I am sitting down and writing things. There's certain things that are in public record that are the things that he's saying and things that are in public record are in opposition to each other. So I've got to, it's kind of long and involved and a little bit complicated, but it's easily proven that the things that he's saying are not accurate. But I've got to sit down and write it out because it is easily proven, but it takes a little bit of doing. But that person is not telling the truth.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of questioning things,
I'm curious though, because I haven't heard this interview. Was he specifically talking about the things that I have been saying recently, or was it an older interview?
No, it was a fairly recent one, and I think you were then on the show a few weeks later. There's a YouTube clip of it when I was doing some research earlier.
Oh, the thing where I was on the Bean, what is it
Kevin
called?
and Bean show, is it, I think?
I can't remember. Yeah. Well, actually, though, what I was reacting to was an interview he had done many years before. So is that the interview you're talking about?
Yeah, that's the one, yeah.
No, I'd love to hear what he has to say in response if he does. My assumption is that he'll make up new lies. That's what I believe he'll do. But I hope he'll just finally realize he's going to get himself in big trouble because he is lying. I'm not, and I mean I have a lot of ways of. There's a lot more I can talk about that I haven't talked about, but that guy is. I think he also hurt himself very badly with having done what he did, because if you look at his career, and part of why I think he has a lot against me is because of my lawsuit. Now this is just assumption. I don't know this for sure, but it was the year that my lawsuit happened. I'm forgetting the exact year. You look at his IMDb page, and he did not work as a writer on a corporately funded and distributed film ever again after my lawsuit. And you look at the years leading up to it, he was working quite regularly. He was working with Steven Spielberg and Robert Zemeckis. And after it, never again. He directed a film that he wrote that he got, like a limited liability kind of corporation together where I'm sure he got favors. And that was the last movie he ever did. That was a little bit after the lawsuit. But he never again was hired in the corporate world. My assumption, I don't know this, it's not on the internet anymore, but I read an article where he was talking in an interview about all of the scripts that he had written that Steven Spielberg had bought up. But none of those scripts were ever produced. And I think, I don't know this, I think Steven Spielberg was personally named in the lawsuit, but Spielberg actually wasn't as involved. He's the most well-known because he's essentially the most famous director there is. But he had something to do with Back to the Future, but that was a Robert Zemeckis film, and Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale co-wrote it, and they had way more to do with what was actually going on than Steven Spielberg. But Steven Spielberg was named in the lawsuit for various reasons, and there were different entities that were part of the lawsuit, and I'm sure Steven Spielberg didn't like that. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure Steven Spielberg said, "Why the hell did this happen?" And I'm sure he knew it was because, and Robert Zemeckis is another interesting topic, but I ended up working with Robert Zemeckis again in a very positive fashion in Beowulf. Mm-hmm. Robert Zemeckis has never lied specifically in the way that Bob Gale has. If you listen to the things, what Robert Zemeckis says is, "I asked for too much money," which, I could have asked for 5 cents, and they could have said that's too much money, and that essentially isn't a lie. There was never an agreement on the salary, but Bob Gale has very specifically lied. He said things that are not true, again, about asking about for the same salary as Michael J. Fox. It's just that never ever came up. In any case, Robert Zemeckis was already way, way successful. He didn't need, certain kinds of help to be working within the corporate industry. But Bob Gale wasn't in that realm. I mean, he had done well just because he'd written Back to the Future and was nominated for that. So you would think he would write quite a bit. But I have a feeling, particularly Steven Spielberg was not happy about what happened, and I have a feeling maybe the reason he bought up all those screenplays was specifically to make sure they didn't get made. I've heard many different things about Spielberg that you don't normally hear about him, and he is obviously a powerful person, and his image is of a real, do-gooder. But I don't know that that's necessarily as actual as one might think.
All right.
I'm sure he controls his image very, very, very carefully. Yeah. If you think about it, you don't really see Spielberg being interviewed or talking except for little things like controlled
junkets and things
junkets.
like that. Yeah.
Well, specifically things that are filmed for his own production. So he's the producer of his own media about him. Mm-hmm. So what is the best description of that but propaganda? Yeah. So I mean, the real person, I met him a few times. He was always nice to my face, but I'm sure he's had not so nice things to say about me in the background. But I'm sure I'm not somebody he thinks about one way or another. It's like he might even realize that what was done was really messed up, and that's why I theorize that he probably is really mad at Bob Gale, because Bob Gale was the architect, essentially, of this, maybe even more than Zemeckis, for all I know. I mean, the both of them had to collaborate and talk about it, but that had to, the concept of utilizing another actor with prosthetics had to be written into the screenplay. It was a concept that needed to be dealt with early on in the writing process. Mm-hmm. And this is ultimately why the negotiations didn't work, was because they had written this into the idea. It was something that they could do early on, and they were very aggressive with their negotiations to make it an undesirable situation for me to be involved in. And that's why the negotiation didn't happen, or it didn't come to. I actually was willing to be in the film. I had questions about it early on when they approached me multiple times. But when I read the screenplay, there were interesting things about the character, but they were aggressively low, less than half of what the other actors who Tom Wilson, Leah Thompson were getting, which would have been the fair negotiation, but they didn't attempt to do a fair negotiation. They wanted to do a negotiation that was making it apparent that they did not want me to be a part of the film, because it wasn't associated with what would have been a proper offer for the part.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's all it must just be the film's very loved, isn't it? But this subject does come up quite a lot, and it's actually good to hear your side of the story.
The reason that I only now have started talking about it specifically was because of these lies that Bob Gale was saying. I'm not going to sit around for it. It's just people believe that stuff. There's nothing I can do in terms of visibility. Bob Gale has done this on these Blu-rays, where there are millions of people that listen to these things and believe it. That's how a good propagandist works. They tell a big lie in a big way first, and then the other person who's been lied about has to kind of be on defense. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I'm in that negative position as it is, but whatever, it's the truth, and I'm going to tell it. Yeah. And if Bob Gale wants to continue his lies, like I say, I've got to sit down, and I am doing some writing things about it, and it's a little bit complicated. It's not just that. I'm writing about some other stuff. I thought it would be something that would take a small amount of time, but I'm being pretty diligent about it. But this stuff is easily the kind of lies that he's talking about are very easily in public record proven to be inconsistent, and it's. Anyhow, enough about him.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to talk to you about, and I'm really fascinated about this, is your interest in the Czech Republic, and more importantly, about some of the property you've bought there. Can you tell us kind of what was it that kind of initially drew you to the Czech Republic?
Well, I do have Czech heritage. At one point, I wanted to go to all of the areas where, when we talk about heritage, we're often talking about who our great-grandparents are, because that's usually about as far back as our knowledge of what our heritage. I mean, some people know. With DNA testing, it gets really interesting, going back thousands of years. But as far as my great-grandparents go, I had German, Swedish, English, and Czech heritage. And actually, a little bit more Czech than anything else in terms of great-grandparents. But so I wanted to go to all these different areas of the country that I had this great-grandparent heritage from, and to see which people I looked the most like. And one of the latter places that I went to or the last of the four, was the Czech Republic, which is incredibly beautiful. It was not bombed out as much in the World Wars I and II the way much of Europe had been, and so there's incredible architectural integrity, and it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was the wealthiest empire for about 500 years in Europe. And, Austria, Germany, portions of Poland, portions of Germany, portions of Poland, all of Austria, all of Hungary, all of the Czech lands were part of this gigantic, very wealthy empire, and the architectural integrity of that area is incredible. But certainly Germany was incredibly bombed out, and Poland. Austria was never. There are portions of Austria that are built up, specifically Vienna, but the Czech lands are really, really quite architecturally endowed, and yet, the last 100 years, there was World War I, and then it was under the German rule. Well, all during the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but then during World War II, and then communism came in until finally 1992. So it's really been sheltered away and not talked about and seen as much as some of other portions of more Western Europe, but it's incredibly beautiful. And it was a good time for me to invest financially. I specifically was looking to buy property. I like to shoot my films on sets. And I realized after making Everything Is Fine, I had invested the money that I made on the first Charlie's Angels film into the sets for shooting Steve's film, Everything Is Fine. It's basically entirely shot on sets, and I like to shoot on sets. Mm-hmm. But it was in a warehouse. I co-directed it with David Brothers, who built the beautiful sets in the film, and I had funded those sets with the money, and kind of had the concept that I would be able to reutilize them on other productions at some point. But the day we had to destroy all the sets the day after because David had lost the lease in the last month of while we were shooting, which was really, disappointing, of course.
Yeah, because they're beautiful sets, aren't they? Especially the exterior sets, fantastic. Yeah. The town set, I thought it looked great.
Yeah, I'm very proud of the whole production, not just the content, the emotional catharsis that happens with the Steve Stewart character, which is really ultimately the most important part, but the physical beauty of the film and the production value is very high. Mm-hmm. So I realized after that happened that if I wanted to continue shooting on sets, that I must own the property, because when you self-fund a film, you don't know exactly, or the way I've done it, I don't know exactly when I'm going to be able to shoot what next. For example, I shot last October. I was planning to shoot more in spring, but I worked on another film just now. I'm touring. I'm needing to make money in order to finance the next portion of the production, and it seems as though I'm going to be acting in something now that I'll be in Mexico for much of the year, I believe, between after the tour here in the UK, I'll be basically going straight to Mexico, and I'll be in Mexico for most of between now and September. And the person that is shooting the film, I'm not sure if he's able to shoot in September, which might mean October, which is over basically exactly a year later. And that's if I can shoot in October. When work comes along for me as an actor, I have to take it, because that's how I make my living. I don't make my living as a filmmaker with my tours. That I kind of, I bring something in from that. But it's not how I'm able to afford it. If I were just doing that, I would have, gone bankrupt years ago. The way that I work, which does have to do with corporate work, is, that's how I do it. Which is an interesting element. That I see that most, not all, but many people working in creative areas have some kind of job working corporately in one way or another, and then essentially subsidize their creativity with that corporate work.
The popular term for it's one for them, one for me, isn't it? Sort of thing.
I don't put it that way, because usually, when you hear somebody say it in exactly that term, you see it written a lot. But usually, when somebody's doing that, they'll say, "Okay, one for them, one for me." But they're working corporately consistently. Like one for them. If they were self-financing their project from the money that they were making as an actor, yes, John Cassavetes, definitely, he did that. But when John Cassavetes was working, he's definitely been a model for me in business. I think he's also a great filmmaker, but he definitely was financing his films by acting in other people's movies. There was a better distribution situation for art films in the 1970s, which he, from what I have researched, slowly got himself involved in a positive way. But he was never making a huge amount of money. I think they were probably making a decent middle-class living, he and Jenna Rollins. But what they accomplished was so fantastic. I mean, it's great what they did, but usually what you see when people, actors are saying, well, one for them, one for me, I would say it's pretty much all for them, meaning all for the corporations, because unless somebody's self-financing, they're doing corporate, they're getting financing corporately to make more corporate situations. Not always. Every once in a while somebody does do that genuinely, but it's pretty rare.
One thing with the location that the property you bought, I've heard that it's been used in some way by a film school locally or a college.
Well, that's not accurate. I mean, there's a lot of plans to do a lot of different things with the chateau. It's an historical monument, and I would like to do a lot of different businesses with it that would have to do with, initially, the main reason I bought it was for my own productions. That's the most important thing, and I bought it a long time ago. I think it's 10 years. It was at least 9 years ago. I changed my dollars over. Basically, it was the year that I did the second Charlie's Angels film, a Willard, and another studio film all in a row. That was still to date my best financial year I've ever had. I took all of that money and put it straight into buying the chateau. I did it I changed my dollars over to the Czech crowns on the day the U.S. invaded Baghdad, because I knew that the dollar was going to slightly go up that day, and then it would fall continuously after that, which it has. I think it was around 28 Czech crowns to the dollar on the day that I transferred, and it's been as low as 12 Czech crowns to the dollar. I think it's about 19 or 20 right now. But it's been terrible for the U.S. Currency that these terrible wars. But in any case, It was a good investment financially. Just the amount that the dollar's fallen with what I put into the property overseas, it's maintained the value, a higher value there than if I had it in the U.S. But in any case, there are other reasons it made sense. They're much lower property taxes. If I owned the same value of property in the United States, no way would I be able to afford it just by the taxes I would have to pay. But it's also quite beautiful. And when I say that, many people go, "Oh, wow, that sounds great. I'm going to do that." And I would never, ever recommend anybody, and I'm particularly talking about people in the U.S., to do what I've done unless they're doing exactly what I'm doing. I don't regret what I've done, but it's an incredible amount of work. It is expensive, and I knew it was a lifelong decision when I made it. It's not something you can really just turn back from, and it's difficult. I mean, the amount of culture shock I've experienced. There are differences, things that I've grown up in a different culture with a different language, and I've spent a significant amount of time in the Czech Republic. I am not integrated in that culture at all, essentially, or very, very little. But yes, it's true. There are attempts to start to integrate into certain kinds of. There are some for-profit businesses I'm interested in. There's some not-for-profit businesses I'm interested in, but all of them take a lot of time and thought and effort. And there's somebody I'm working with in the UK. I think you know, who's been wanting to help, and he's a good fellow, and anything's possible. I would like the idea of doing things that are good for film and good for film education, and things that possibly could be good for working with people with disabilities. I do have interest in that for a lot of different reasons, but these are. It's hard to know. I mean, economically, what does and doesn't make sense. I struggle with that all the time, and it's a lot. It's a lot of doing. But I don't have any I have not had any formal business with any educational elements. I've had informal business, some of which has been nice, and some things have been rather confusing. There was one thing that happened where somebody was supposed to be involved in the shooting of the film that was with I won't say what it was, but an educational system that didn't happen. It just ever makes it clearer for me. I can't. I've got to do everything essentially myself when I produce a film. I can really. It's very difficult to rely on anybody unless they're there, literally on the property helping you. Those are the people you rely on, and I had great volunteers that worked on the film. That's the only way I'm able to afford to do it. And I had about 17 people that were staying at the chateau while we were in production for the 10-day shoot, and they were amazing. They did a great job, and I'm very grateful to them. Those are the people that genuinely helped me make the film. I mean, there are peripheral people that will help do things that help the film, but actually physically on the film. And 17 is not a lot making a feature film. That's actually a very small crew, but it's the space that I have in the chateau. I have 17 rooms so that people are able to sleep, which is, of course, a lot. And it's, nice and a relatively elegant surrounding for making a film, but it's a lot of work, a lot of hours. And I knew on the 10 days I didn't shoot the entire feature because I knew it was my first time shooting there, and I predicted there would be difficulties. I didn't know what they would be, but I've worked in Czech long enough to know things happen, and there's communication difficulties, and the culture works differently there, and and of course there were things that happened, and I'm very glad that I was careful with how I did that production. I learned quite a bit, and next production I will utilize those things I learned, and hopefully they'll be those things will have been addressed, and maybe only a few new things will come up that I have to deal with. There's always something to deal with in film production. That is how things they happen. You're working with people, you're working with sets, you're working with actors, and it's a lot. But I do ultimately like it. Production is not my favorite part of the filmmaking. My favorite part of filmmaking is editing. Production's like war.
Yeah.
And editing is like the peace process, where you're making everything
That's a really good way of putting
again.
it, actually.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Okay. One thing just before, because I've had you on the phone for quite a while now, and I don't want to use up all your day.
Oh, it's all right.
I've obviously last night I got 3 of your books, and I was wondering very quickly if we could just have a quick chat about the books as well, because I think they're fantastic. Could you talk about kind of some of the inspiration that goes behind them, and also the production, because they're beautiful volumes, aren't they? I mean, they're very they're lovely volumes. Yeah,
I'm proud of the books as well. And it's funny to me because the books, a lot of the same energy that went into making the books when I was in the 80s and early 90s, really that transferred into making the films. Even though it seems very different, on some level for me, energy-wise, it's the same creative, and I talk about editing and the finishing source. There's something related to them about me. More specifically, what is it is even thematically has to do with some of the books that I perform in the shows. Sometimes people have pointed things out about the content, thematic content in some of the books, or specific content in the books that I didn't even realize, and I realized, oh, yeah, they're right. They'll say it at a show. And I hadn't even thought about it, which to me is a good sign. It means that there's something subconsciously being expressed that I wasn't even aware was happening. Which to me that is when good art happens.
Yeah.
But I'm proud of the books. I remember when I first started publishing, and through my company, Volcanic Eruptions is my book publishing company's name. And I remember I was thinking I would use a slogan of, I'd never used it, but Volcanic Eruptions, where we believe you can tell a good book by its cover, because the books are nicely bound, and part of the aesthetic of the entire book is part of what is what I would consider a nice element about it. Of course, the famous thing is you can't tell a book by its cover, but sometimes you can if it's just a pretty book. Yeah. And of course, and I do think the books are pretty, but there's interesting content, of course, as well.
There seems to be a theme with a few of your books where you've taken older text and kind of reimagined it, kind of repurposed it almost.
Yeah, the way that it came about, the books were done in a lot of different ways, but the very first book I ever made, which I haven't published or put in the shows, it was called Billow in the Rock. I was in an acting class when I studied acting from 15 till age 20, but an acting class I went for 2 years, age 19 and 20. It was, in the 80s, on La Brea in Los Angeles, and down the street on the same block was an art gallery that had a art bookstore upstairs. And there was a small section that had artists' handmade books. And there were a lot of different kinds. Some were just like art objects. Some person had taken an old binding from the 1800s and they put their artwork in it. And I thought that was a good idea. And I'd always drawn and written from a young age, and I was working a lot with Indie Ink at the time, and I decided I would do the same thing. And I went to a bookstore on Melrose. I think it's still there. Many of the books I used to get books at old bookstores are not around anymore, but I think that one's there. In any case, I found a binding called Billow in the Rock, and I found some other books that had some interesting illustrations, and I started putting my own artwork in this book. And I always had liked words in art, and so I left a few words on one page. And then I did some other art and put some other Indie Ink things, artwork in it, and then a few pages later I left a few more words and had gotten rid of the other words with Indie Ink. And when I was reviewing it, I started realizing there was a new narrative, a new story that was taking place, and I liked it. So I kind of went with that and was putting illustrations in. And when I finished the whole thing, I really liked it, and I showed it to people, and they thought it was really interesting, and I liked doing it, so I kept making more of them. And altogether, I made about 20 of them from the early 80s to the early 90s for about 10 years. And I miss making the books. I did make one book relatively recently as I was developing the second slideshow, because I have two different slideshows. I have one that I developed to start performing before Everything Is Fine, and then the original slideshow, which I performed before What Is It? The first slideshow, the very first time I ever performed it was in 93, before I had What Is It? Before I'd even started shooting What Is It? And it immediately, the 8 books that I chose, it went perfectly. Like, it was, people wanted to start booking it, people liked it. I've always performed that show exactly the same. As I started developing a new show for the second film, that one was, because I had selected the books that were right for performing. Some of the books that I made were either way too wordy, or they worked on different levels than a book to perform would be. Some of them were just art objects, essentially. And so I'd chosen probably the best ones to perform for the first slideshow. So I had to deal with a new structure and new book slideshow, and I included some books that I hadn't had in the show that didn't really perform as well some of the first times I started performing that show. And I had one series of images that I'd saved in a drawer, and art that I had done that I had conceptualized, realizing it could be a good performance book. It was the only time I ever developed a book for the idea of a performance. The other books were specifically made as books, but this one was made, and it's the only book I didn't actually make as a physical book. I scanned it into the computer and then made the slideshow of it. It does not exist as a book at this point, but it works very well as a performance piece in the show, and in a certain way it's almost even more effective than any of the books that are in the first show. So the two slideshows now are very, once I started performing that new book, which I was glad of, that a new book that I made actually worked, because I hadn't made a new book in a long, long time. And now if I start touring, I start with the new movie, which is not part 3 of the trilogy, but the one for myself and my father to act in together, which is the first time he and I have ever acted together, was just this last October. This was a project I specifically developed for that to happen. And if I tour with that in the same way I have been, which seems likely, I'll have to develop a whole new, some kind of show, which I haven't figured out yet. I've got to finish that film first. Yeah, the books, I almost look at it as a letter to myself from me as a younger person to me now, and I'm glad that I had no concept that this would be as important a part of my life as it is, because it was something I just did for my own enjoyment and to show to friends. I had no idea I would publish them. I had no idea that I would be touring with them, performing them. It was just, that was not what I was thinking about at all. So it's fascinating to me that it's become such an integral part of my life. Which is one of my favorite things. Joseph Campbell, I study Hero's Journey story structure all the time. One of my favorite subjects and Hero's Journey story structure, coming from Joseph Campbell's great 1948 book, Hero with a Thousand Faces, where he recognized he was friends with Jung, and of course Jung was friends with Freud, and they were all interested in the human subconscious and coming at it from different ways. And what Joseph Campbell realized was a certain pattern that was happening in various mythologies around the world, that there are archetypes of characters and structural elements that it's very valuable for writing. But he said something also which is been something people will talk about now, where he said, follow your bliss, which I think is just a tremendous piece of advice. Basically, follow that which you're passionate about. And that, I think, is as opposed to following something that is you feel like you need to do in order to make money. Follow the thing that you really are passionate about, and essentially that money will follow because you have so much more energy to put into that which you're passionate about. I mean, I've essentially recouped on the films in year 6 of touring, which is a long time. Yeah. But even when I say I recouped, the way I really recouped was 50% by that which I make by the live performance, 25% by the book sales, and 25% by the box office, which would mean if I were to really recoup just by the box office of the films, it would take about 24 years of touring. But I never cared about that. I still don't care about that. All I cared about was that I could justify to be able to put money again into another production, so I could continue making my own films, and I've justified that. So that's all that mattered to me. But it's a good example of following that which you're passionate about, because I have so much more energy. This is a lot of work. and it, it does affect my personal life, how my whole existence is.
Mm-hmm.
But that's okay. I want to do these things. I don't mean to complain, because I worked very hard to get to the position where I'm working very hard to self-distribute the films and show them to people, but it's worth it. I'm very glad to do it, and I'm very grateful to the people that come and get something out of the shows.
Yeah, and people definitely do. And last night, people were buzzing afterwards. They were, everyone really appreciated you coming down to coming down here to the UK to to show the films. And
and I like coming to places that people don't expect me to be as well, because there's even more gratefulness, really, and excitement, and that you can feel that, and it's terrific.
Yeah. Just one last very quick point on the books. We had a listener who, and also I'm a personal fan of this particular work, what it is and how it is done. Is that released in any form, or is that just part of the live show at the moment?
There was a performance. That's the only time I've let any kind of performance be recorded. I was on the Dennis Miller show I think it was very early 90s, and I performed that book, and it was carefully kind of directed. I don't perform the book in the show in the same way that I performed it in the live show. I don't perform it in the same way that I did when I performed it on the Dennis Miller show. Even then, it wasn't the way I normally performed it, but it's okay. I was aware even then that it was good to have one little piece of something that people would be able to kind of go, I see. And that is, you can find that on the internet. But like I say, it's different in certain ways from how I actually perform the piece. But I had published it at one point in an amalgamation of 3 different books under one title, What It Is and How It Is Done. That book is no longer in print, and I worked with a printer at one point who was not good, and he lost negatives of that initial printing, which is really unprofessional, as you can imagine. My other negatives for my other books were with different people. I still have most of the original artwork. There's one thing that I don't have, which really irritates me, but I can still get a copy of it from the original printings of the book. I don't love that I don't have the initial thing. I don't know what happened to that. But in any case, I do need to reprint that book, because it's actually quite a good book. But I probably, when I reprint it, I would do it in a different way. I had 3 titles under one book. I had A Son of Mother, What Is It, and a book called The Betrothed. But it's probably better for me to keep them separate. It had something to do with page count as well, and because they're hardbound books, there is a certain amount of thickness that a hardbound book needs just to be able to physically bind it. So I have to investigate it a little more. But there's another book that I really want to publish called Round My House, which was always the first book I wanted to publish, but it was a color book. It's probably my favorite book, which is one that doesn't use really any text from the original books. It's essentially a handwritten book, and I'm very happy with the structure. It's probably the best one for me to for me personally as a performer for the shows. And I need to publish that book. I had done all of the boards. I was almost done with the boards last year, and I lost my computer on a train that I fell asleep on in Penn Station. I woke up and I was at the station. I got off the train. I didn't realize till later that night I'd had the computer out and I never got it back, and I lost those boards. A couple other things I lost as well, very awful, that were not backed up. Anyhow, I need to publish that book. I need to publish a number of things, but my money is often tied up in my films, and that's the case right now. So it's it's a juggling act. I need to act in other people's films, and that of course takes time, which is fine. I'm glad to be doing it, and then I need to go and make my own films and tour. I used to have a lot more time. I don't anymore. I wish I did. It's funny because I wanted, a long time ago, I wanted to be doing more things. I'm getting older too. I just turned 50, and there are things that you can feel from that. But it's when I was maybe 25, it would have been easier for me to tour as much as I do. And again, I like touring, but I can feel it on my body. I get quite exhausted from the tours.
I was talking to Henry Rollins a few years ago, who tours extensively as well, doing spoken word tours, and he was saying exactly the same thing, that he loves to tour, but he's starting to find it more and more, you don't kind of recover as quickly as you used to.
I'm sure. Yeah, it's an interesting thing about Henry Rollins, because I initially, when my first book that I published was Rat Catching, and there was a woman who used to publish Henry Rollins' books. He self-publishes his books as well, but he initially was working with a woman named Laura Cloud. She's no longer alive, but she was who I was originally. She worked with people that were well known for one thing or another, and she initially worked with him, and then I knew somebody else that knew him. And I was initially going to work with her, but she did something wrong with the boards, and I just realized I needed to do it on my own. But so I was aware that Henry Rollins did well with his book sales by doing essentially book readings, live book readings. So I went and saw some of his shows as a live performer. And that was something that I was aware of before I started touring with my shows, and so I know him from the 80s, from that specific situation having to do with the book publishing.
Anyway, thanks you so much for giving us some of your time.
Yes.
I really appreciate it. It's been a long time coming. I've been leading up to getting you on. I'm a huge admirer of your work, and I think you're a true artist. And it's a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm at a hotel, and I think somebody's knocking on the door about housekeeping. They don't have a do not disturb sign here. But and people, if they want to know about the shows and films, they can go on to sign up for the newsletter on crispinglover.com. And this is it has a list of where all my shows and tours are, and there's also an official Crispin Hellion Glover Facebook page and a Crispin Glover Twitter as well. But the best way to know is by signing up on the newsletter, and they can just look and see what's going on, but they'll be reminded by many emails, sometimes too many probably for some people, and that's why the Twitter and Facebook are valuable as well.
Yeah, excellent. Well, we'll also post we're going to get this into you up as quickly as possible, and we'll post all the tour dates for the rest of your UK tour. Yeah. But do stay in touch, and it'd be great to have you back on again at some point. And,
absolutely, it's fantastic. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Crispin. That's great.
All right, you too. All right. Have a great day.